Released in 2001 by Konami and developed by the Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo Group, Castlevania Circle of the Moon is the first game in the Castlevania series to grace Nintendo's then brand spanking new Game Boy Advance handheld system. And while this entry adopts the exploration-focused Igavania style that had been popularized by 1997's Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, Circle of the Moon is one of the few games in this vein not headed by Koji Igarashi, and for this reason it's perhaps the most interesting of the trilogy of Castlevania games to grace Nintendo's final Game Boy generation. And I mean that with all sincerity because it's a generally different beast from the usual Iga output, though not by much. Bit of a fun little note. Circle of the Moon was my first formal introduction to the Igavania style, though my first time playing this game was not on an OG Game Boy Advance, but rather through an emulator on a computer that was barely able to run the thing at a half-decent speed. Hence, I could see all the little details in the graphics, while the rest of you were stuck trying to aim your non-lit GBAs into the sun or something. And that always sucks, I'm not gonna lie. Wouldn't be until a couple years later where I get my hands on the later GBA SP model with the backlight, and a few more years afterwards before I'd come across a copy of Circle of the Moon to call my very own, and that's what we're using for today's video. I know there's the Advanced Collection and it's fine and all, but I already had a DVD rip on hand from a prior playthrough, which was much more convenient for my purposes, and so here we are. The story of Circle of the Moon revolves not around the Belmont clan of vampire killers, but rather the little-known Baldwin clan of vampire killers who have their own mystical whip to trade around. Apparently the Baldwins, comprising Old Man Morris, younger son Hugh, and family friend Nathan Graves, were trying to interrupt Dracula's latest forced revival, but alas, they're too late and Dracula sends the two boys to their dooms. And so Hugh fucks off to do his own thing while you assume the role of Nathan Graves and his hunter's whip. From there, Circle plays out much as you would expect a game of this ilk to play out. You roam around the little sections of the castle looking for items to increase your abilities, slay monsters to gain experience points, destroy candles to uncover hearts, money bags, and the occasional sub-weapon to use. Eventually, you'll have to encounter bosses to defeat in order to progress onwards, or gain some new relic that expands your explorational abilities. Not much to it really. If you've played one of these games, then Circle of the Moon is old hat. Now the main gimmick of the game is the dual setup system, or DSS, something that was an interesting experiment of sorts. The idea is as you kill monsters, they will occasionally drop magic cards, of which there are 20 and they are divided into two types: action cards and attribute cards. You then select an action card and an attribute card from your inventory, and you press the L trigger to activate the DSS system and assume some sort of ability based on the cards used, whether it be temporary new weapons such as flame whips or swords or things of that nature, or maybe enhanced stats or other extra abilities that can be used provided you have enough magic in your meter, which thankfully regenerates as time passes. The DSS concept is unique to say the least, and while grinding for hearts might not be the most exciting thing ever since drops are generally somewhat infrequent, especially in regards to items and even more so for the cards, discovering the various two-card combinations and their effects and applying them to your basic strategy, if at all, yields its own adventure. It's a nice way of giving Nathan Graves some more stuff without actually giving him more stuff. All of these different whips aren't things that you pick up and equip. There are things you could turn on and off with the proper cards selected. The grind and the search throughout the castle are your only means of producing wares. There's no shop to purchase or even offload items of any sort, and grinding is often the sore spot for many games of this ilk, especially if it's your only means of getting the better part of the good stuff that isn't tucked in some corner of the castle somewhere. And if you want to survive Circle of the Moon's machinations, you'll need to do some heavy lifting to get yourself equipped for such challenges. And say what you will about the way the game looks or how dark it is during the days when light was a bit of a premium, Circle of the Moon offers its fair share of challenge, whether it be against overpowered foes, puzzles with push blocks, or just some good old-fashioned platforming bits. Dry on the exposition for the most part, but there's plenty of clever and varied level layouts throughout the game that feels more fleshed out than the later Igavania games that would come along. And this only had one castle to explore instead of giving the game a second flipped or copy and pasted castle to inflate the playtime further. Not to mention this tidbit that I like, where as you progress through the game, certain areas you'll revisit will feature more powerful enemies than they did before, which I thought was a nice, subtle touch. In some ways, Circle comes across as the perfect marriage between the old school Vania's platforming and whip play, and the new school Vania's more open-ended role-playing inspired exploration that the series would adopt. This is the most Castlevania of the GBA Castlevanias that ever Castlevania'd, whether the guy in a hat wants to admit it or not. And I would take this any day of the week over something like, I don't know, Order of Ecclesia, which, I'm sorry, is about as much of a Castlevania game as Castle Quest. Anyone remember Castle Quest? It was the one that looked like this. If or when Konami eventually releases the Castlevania DS collection, then I'll go further into it, but until then, this is one backstory I'm keeping in my back pocket. Back to Circle of the Moon. When it comes to control, Circle works well enough, but definitely could have been better. While Nathan can only whip left or right, by holding down the B button, he can spin his whip in place, creating a makeshift shield of sorts to defend against projectiles, or just lay in many quick hits on stationary foes. Nathan walks slowly, but a double tap will cause him to run, which helps with his leaps. Unfortunately, Nathan's jumps are not his strong suit. While you do have mid-air control over your leaps, if you were to change direction mid-air during a running leap, you lose all forward momentum and drop down. Activating your DSS combination with the L trigger and using the R trigger for the extra moves you gain leaves no room for that wonderful Igarashi backdash that I've honestly probably only used once or twice in these games, mostly by accident. Yeah, control in Circle of the Moon could have been tighter, more polished, but like I said, it works well enough for what you have here. Unlike the other Igavania games, Circle doesn't unlock any new characters or game modes when you beat the game, so there's no boss rush mode or secondary character with no story mode or anything like that. However, completing the game will give you names to enter when you start a new game to give you different playstyles of sorts that affect your stats and abilities. So instead of the default Vampire Killer style, which is what you start with, you might get a Magician mode that grants you all 20 DSS cards at the cost of lower magic, or there's a Thief mode that gives you really low stats but more frequent drops, and there's probably a couple others. And it's a modest means of increasing the replay value for those who want it, but it doesn't really change the overall experience all that much aside from new preset stats. I might roll my eyes at a Richter mode that feels slapped on and superfluous, but at least it's something different. Other than that, it's something, I guess. Circle's graphic style is somewhat dark and moody, which is nice because it gives it a bit of atmosphere, but not so nice when the system you play this on has no backlight, and as such, the game becomes difficult to see under most lighting conditions or lack thereof. Fortunately, with the Game Boy Advance SP, the Game Boy Micro, some of the early Nintendo DS models, as well as anything that lets you play GBA games on a television or a monitor, this shouldn't be a problem or an excuse. Sadly, once you add light to the proceedings, you'll find Circle of the Moon to be something of a bland-looking game. The characters aren't all that impressive looking, the various backdrops are serviceably adequate and not much else. There's quite a bit of sprite recycling here. The same skeleton sprite can be used to create up to a dozen variety of skeletal foes. Though to be fair, Igarashi recycled shit all the time in his game, so I can't be too harsh in this regard. Circle's a very pedestrian looking game. There's stuff on screen that looks like what it's supposed to, and that's all you could really say about it. There's some variety in the scenery, but nothing notable. Neither good nor bad, it's just there. Well, I tell a fib, the last fight with Dracula in that alternate dimension is pretty sweet, but that's about it. Circle of the Moon's soundtrack comprises a number of remixed classic tunes from Castlevania past, as well as a handful of original tunes. Actually, there might be more remixed tunes here than there are original tracks, which probably adds to the somewhat blasé feel of the game. While the remixes aren't bad per se, and some even fit in nicely with certain areas of the game for the most part, they feel like, well, we have tunes people like, let's remake those instead of coming up with some original stuff. And it's a bit of a shame because the few original tracks that are in the game, Awake and the song that plays during the final fight with Dracula, for example, I forget the name, are actually pretty damn good. Not to mention, this is probably the best sounding Castlevania on the Game Boy Advance, as the two follow-ups, while boasting more original tunes, don't quite reach that level of quality. Overall, Castlevania Circle of the Moon is a fun little challenging game with some solid platforming bits and formidable boss fights. The DSS cards are a nice little gimmick to spruce up the variety, and there's more of a focus on straight up combat than dicking around in subquests for sweaters and such. Of course, the dark, bland visuals, the somewhat rigid controls, the less than inspired character designs, and the constant need to grind due to a lack of a shop hampers the package somewhat, but it's still a solid Castlevania game that feels the most Castlevania out of the GBA bunch. So kudos to the Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo group that's probably defunct by this point, but you did good. You did good with this Castlevania Circle of the Moon game. Very enjoyable game, I enjoyed it. Thanks, bye.